All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Rhoda Madrigal, and I'll be taking you through today's session. I'm joined virtually by some of my colleagues who may speak up during our Q&A session or to provide clarity when needed as we're discussing this topic. We're here today to talk about the changes that we are implementing as part of the RIMS enhancements effort. In an effort to increase transparency and provide greater service to our stakeholders, we are recording this webinar. I've just hit record a moment ago. It'll be posted on our website so that you can review it in the future, and for those of you who are not able to join the call today. The slides that we will be going through are currently posted on CAISO.com and can be found in the ISO Learning Center under New Modules. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask Andrew Brown to say hello to folks, and then after that, Heidi Carter. Andrew, if you'll go ahead.
Hi, this is Andrew Brown, Senior Implementation Analyst with New Resource Implementation.
Thank you. And then Heidi.
Hello, everyone. My name is Heidi Carter. I'm with the Customer Readiness Group. I am one of the trainers here. Thank you. And I'll be monitoring the chat. So if you could please open the chat at this time, I can keep that monitored. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. I have set this up so that everyone becomes muted when we enter the WebEx. We ask that you keep yourself muted to minimize background noise for everybody and for the recording later. If you would like to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself, or as Heidi mentioned, you can put a question in the chat pod there, or you can raise your hand using the WebEx tool, and your hand will float to the top of the list there, and we'll call on you when we have a moment. So that's how we'll run today's session. We have about, just about 24 slides to get through, so I don't anticipate that this will take the full hour, but we did want to give you ample opportunities after we shared what we were changing for you to ask any questions that you have. So with that, we'll get right into it here. Today, we're going to be talking about RIMS enhancements, and the changes that we're making to RIMS essentially are being made to align the due date of the various documentation, the required documentation, to align with the build cycle for the full network model database. The goal of today's session is to make sure that everyone is aware that these deadlines are firm and need to be met in order to facilitate a smooth implementation process of your resources. We are going to be implementing these changes in the RIMS production environment the week of January 24th, probably in the middle of the week, but we are going to announce the official go-live date via notice posted to CAISO.com. Those will also go out in the daily briefing. And you'll also receive a customer service notice email to all RIMS users, similar to if those of you who are on the call are RIMS users today, you would have received a notice about this training session. That same customer service notice email is going to go to you to announce the actual implementation date that will take place in about 2 weeks. During today's session, we're going to talk about a couple of things. First, we'll go over what we do today. Then we'll talk about what is changing. We'll give you an opportunity to ask any questions, and then we'll wrap up with a follow-up at the end. Just a handful of acronyms that we're going to be using today. You're probably familiar with all of these. The main one that we'll be touching on is the project details form. We're going to talk about changes to that and also submission deadlines around choosing implementation dates when you're submitting the project details form. So first we'll talk about what we do today. This is a screenshot of the new resource implementation page on CAISO.com. For those of you that are familiar with this page, this is not new information, but I wanted to kind of center the discussion today to talk about the focus of today's session is really kicking off those new projects. So down there at the bottom of the screenshot of that page, today we're going to be focusing on the new RIMS project details form and how, when you're creating RIMS projects, you need to make sure that you're selecting the right implementation date and being aware of those model build cutoff deadlines. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. And with that, we'll talk about the current process. Today, the current process is that when you are wanting to implement a new project, you will create a project details form. You'll upload that into the RIMS application, and then RIMS today creates deadlines or validates your project creation based on whether or not it's greater than or equal to 84 days from your implementation date. And today, those deadlines for submitting documentation into those various buckets have a due date of no less than 84 days from implementation. That is what we are changing. So now we'll talk about the changes that are going to be happening. And really, first we wanted to mention that we have what we call a bucket system. There's 6 different buckets to get you from creation all the way through your commercial operation date. And the bucket system is derived from the database release schedule that we have for the full network model. And we base that on the generation project's estimated implementation date. The due dates that get set are specific to actually the acceptance of that required documentation. So these are acceptance deadlines that need to be met in order to be considered for that target full network model build that we're trying to get that resource into. So today, the changes that are going to be made are to align the bucket 1 and bucket 2 due dates to that full network model build cycle. And I have a recreation of the full network model build schedule here on the screen so that we can use it for reference and for conversational purposes. Essentially, what we're saying is the dates for the required documentation, that deadline date must be by that customer model document submission deadline in that first column. And then when you are creating a new project and selecting an implementation date, you also need to make sure that that project implementation date is at least 15 calendar days past the production deployment effective date. And so we've got a couple of examples that we're going to go through a little bit later that will say, if you submitted on this date, this is how it would work. You know, this is a successful path, and these are times where your project details form would be rejected for various reasons. So we'll talk about that. The changes that we are making and how they impact you are listed out on this slide here. First of all, we're updating the project details form. So once this becomes implemented in about 2 weeks, version 12A of that project details form is the one that you need to use going forward. And if you upload PDFs, so first of all, the document is changing. Second of all, you need to be aware of the timelines, because if you upload PDFs to the RIMS application using the old timelines, it's possible that your project may not be created. So if you're following the same process you had been following for quite some time, you're going to find that things are getting rejected when you were expecting them to be accepted. So you'll get an email that says you had an error with your submission, and you'll need to go ahead and select a new implementation date and re-upload the PDF. So we wanted to get out in front of this for you so that hopefully you could become familiar with the new timing and not have this kind of rework required. So the new process is to complete the project details form. Again, version 12A will be the only one that is accepted once these changes are implemented into production. I have a picture of the new project details form on the right. You will see that we have made some changes in the description when it talks about implementation date as a reminder about the new dates and how that is going to be structured. So the project from now on, or once this becomes implemented in production, the project is going to be created based on new criteria that make sure that the scope cutoff date for that full network model document submission deadline to make sure that scope is still open, and to also make sure that the implementation date that you have selected is at least 15 calendar days past that production deployment of the new or of that specific full network model build and the associated effective date. So once we implement this in production, RIMS will no longer validate on this greater than or equal to 84 days from the implementation date. Instead, it's going to double check the model build submission deadline and make sure that that document submission window is open, and make sure that your implementation date is at least 15 calendar days past that model build effective date. And just a reminder, in RIMS, these dates that we're referring to when we're talking about a specific full network model, when your project is created, when you upload the project details form, there will be a project model that gets determined at that time, and it'll tell you the model build there. And then when you actually go through the process and have all of your required documentation accepted, you're going to see a assigned model will show you what the assigned model build is that has been selected for this particular project. I have a couple of examples that I'd like to go through, but before that, let's take a quick pause and see, before we dive into that, if anybody has any questions on what we've talked about so far. Feel free to unmute yourself or put a question in the chat.
Radha, we do have a couple of questions that have come in from the chat. The first one is, can we find a list of production deployment dates on CaliforniaISO.com?
Yes, absolutely. So there is the full network model build schedule. It looks like Priyanka has put a note there in the chat with a link to that. I also have a link to that full network model build schedule in this presentation at the end under reference material. So it's there in the chat, and it'll also be at the end of the presentation.
Great. Thank you. And there's another question. Does this apply to SCME projects as well?
Good question, Chandra. Andrew, can you take that one?
Sure. It does not apply to SCME projects. SCME projects don't go through a model build. Yeah, or Priyanka can add to this as well.
Thank you, Andrew. There are two types of SCME projects. The SCME projects that are required to provide telemetry have to go through the full network model process, and they have to follow the same timelines as Radha has mentioned earlier. The other SCME projects, which are meter only, and if that resource ID is already in the ISO master file, then they have a shorter timeline and they go through NRI process, not through RIMS. For them, the timeline is shorter. And that can be found on NRI checklist. NRI checklist has that information for SCME projects, which does not need a new resource ID in ISO master file.
Okay, great, thank you. I've also got a link to, at the end of this presentation, a link to that NRI web page where you can find that checklist that Priyanka just mentioned. Any other questions?
I don't see any other questions in the chat at this time, but if you do want to ask a question verbally, go ahead and raise your hand and we can unmute you. Thank you. No hands raised at this time, Radha.
All right, let's go into the examples. So we've talked about these dates, but in order to kind of wrap your mind around it, we'll actually go through a couple of scenarios just to make sure that we've got everything got everything set. So in this example, we have laid out a successful creation. So I've highlighted or circled the particular full network model build that I'm targeting, which is FNM 22 month 7, so the month of July model build. And I'm saying in this particular example, we submit the customer submits the project details form. on April 1st and has an implementation date selected of August 9th. So based on the criteria, we're looking at the customer model build submission deadline. That deadline is May 5th. So April 1st is before that, so it meets that criteria. And then the second criteria checks the model build production deployment date and makes sure that the implementation date is at least 15 days after that production effective date. So in the specific case, the project is created and the customer will receive an email with the project code that has been created in RIMS. So that is example one. Now we have two examples that are going to be unsuccessful for two different reasons, and we'll talk about both of those. The first unsuccessful scenario, which is scenario 2, in this particular instance, the customer submits the project details form on April 1st with an implementation date of July 27th. Even though the customer model document submission deadline is still open, even though the scope for that model build is still open, the implementation date that was selected is less than 15 days. It's only 2 days after that production deployment date, which is July 25th. So in this particular case, the customer will receive an email with an error message indicating that the project was not created, and instead the customer would need to select a new implementation date and re-upload that project details form. Now, I wanted to point something out here with regard to implementation date. If the desired implementation date was actually July 27th, in order to make that work, what needed to happen would have been targeting the model build before that, so 22 month 6, which means that that project details form should have been uploaded prior to March 17th, so that that document model submission deadline would still be open. And in fact, you know, you would have to have gotten all of your documentation in and then accepted by that date. So you can have dates such as July 27th, as long as you target the correct model build that would allow that to be implemented. Let's take a look and see if there's, I think there might be some questions in the chat, so let's take a look there.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions that have come in. The first one is, can you share the reason or process driver for the 15 days between production deployment date and implementation date?
Thanks, Heidi. Andrew, do you want to take that one on?
Sure. So there's kind of a couple of reasons for that. One is that production deployment date, notice it says the week of. And so one issue with that is, depending on the modeling process, it takes time for that deployment to roll through all of our systems here at the ISO. And so it might be up to 4 or 5 days for everything to be synced up across all of the different computer systems within the ISO. So there's some time there. And then the other item is that when it comes to doing the SC association can't be effective until the model has deployed, just because master file can't make those associations effective until the resource is actually in the full network model. So we're trying to build in some time so that we don't have issues where somebody picks the day of, in this case, they pick 7/26. The model actually isn't deployed until the 28th, and then we still have those days where it needs to roll through. And now we're having to explain to them why they can't sync on the date they originally wanted to. There's also issues with their SC associations at that point. So it's mostly for us to try to safeguard that implementation date so that processes that occur at the ISO don't impact the project schedule that this project might have been putting together. So those are the reasons we picked the 15 days. It provides enough time for those model deployments to roll through the ISO databases, and then also allows, if there's an SC association, that won't be impacted.
And there was the follow-up
Okay.
or another question that said, can you repeat if the validation rules are greater than or equal to 15 days? You could just make that a little more explicit.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So the validation is greater than or equal to 15 days. So 15 days or more beyond the production effective date.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Oh, never mind, one just came in. Are there any discussions about having the FNM schedule be more consistent between builds? 110 to 314 is over 2 months, whereas 725 to 103 is only 5 weeks, as an example.
I'm not connected enough to the full network model build process to know that. Andrew or possibly Priyanka, do either of you know if there are any changes or if there are any discussions about changing that schedule at this point?
So the timeline is also based on other internal and external schedules, like our spring release and our fall release. So it's not to coincide with those dates, because at that time our IT will be doing other policy changes and other system changes based on the new initiative. So that's the reason the dates are spread out. And also we remove the holidays, other public holidays, and make sure it doesn't coincide with any other major milestone.
Great, thank you. There's another question. Does this apply to transmission projects?
Andrew, can you clarify that?
Sure. It does apply to transmission projects as well.
Okay, great, thank you.
This time I'm not seeing any other questions that are coming in the chats, and no raised hands for verbal questions.
All right, we've got another example that we wanted to share. And this one highlights the need to have the model documents approved by a certain date and make sure the scope window is open. So in this example, the project details form was uploaded on May 6th with an implementation date of August 9th. And this project in the scenario does not get created because although the implementation date is 15 days after the production effective date, that scope is no longer open. The model document submission deadline date was May 5th, and this was submitted a day after. So two things have to be valid for those projects to be created. That scope window needs to be open, and the project implementation date needs to be 15 days or more past that model effective date. So key points to kind of wrap this up before we'll open it up for some final questions. And that is, to tie it all together, we're going to be updating the documentation due dates in RIMS with the full network model build cycle that we just discussed. We went over a couple of examples. Again, to reiterate, those due dates are for when the documentation, the required documentation, needs to be accepted by the ISO. When you are selecting a project implementation date, make sure that the scope window for the database that you are targeting is still open and the implementation date that you have selected is at least 15 days past the model build's production deployment effective date. To get all of this together for you, we're going to be updating the NRI guide, the RIMS project details form to the new version 12A, and also the RIMS quick start guide. So all of that information that you use to refer to when creating these projects. We're going to be updating that with the latest information that will be published around the same time as the implementation of this into production. So with that, I'd like to ask if anybody has any final questions before we conclude today's session.
As a reminder, you can either raise your hand next to your name or put a question in the chat. And we did get a chat question. Are you planning to switch to Google Chrome?
I don't know off the top of my head the answer to that question. Andrew or Priyanka, do you by chance know if we're going to be switching to that?
Currently, you can use Google Chrome with RIMS. Is that the question that you're asking?
I think so, in the chat there.
Okay.
So Vladimir, are you using Google Chrome but finding it not working for you?
Yeah, just to say, so here at the ISO, I think we pretty much always use Google Chrome when operating in RIMS. So to my understanding, well, my experience is that Google Chrome works fine with RIMS. So if that's not your case, that would be unusual.
This is Heidi. Vladimir and everyone, we do have a developer site that if you haven't been into that before on our ISO website, you can go down there near the bottom. There's a link to the developer site. You just need to request permissions to get in there. It does get information about all of our different applications as well as the systems that are supported. There are forums where you can ask questions about the different technologies. So that's always a good place to find more of this information too, especially as different applications change on the background. So we do have one more question. It says, can you please reshare the PowerPoint of successful example?
Yes, absolutely. So that's back on the screen here for you. A successful example for you to take a look at. I also got, while we're looking at this, there was a question that was sent to me in private chat that asked whether this change impacts current projects in production. So Andrew, if you could give an answer to the group for that, that may be a question that other folks have on their mind as well.
Sure. This change is only for projects being created going forward. So if your project is already created, that is fine. This will just be for projects being created in the future.
All right, thanks. We have one more question that just came in from the chat. And it says, based on this training, it sounds like the PDF is a quote unquote dumb form, i.e. without Boolean or logic check. Is there an opportunity to make it a smart form that won't allow unsuccessful project creation requests?
Now that is something that's outside the scope of the changes for this particular implementation. I guess what I can do with that is take the request and pass that along to the project team to see if that is something that they are able to take on. My kind of guess on that is that because these full network model scope creation dates may change or be updated, that it might be easier to have that check inside of the RIMS application itself than implementing it in the form, but that's an IT thing that I'm not sure exactly how that works. So Gary, with that question, I'll just pass that along to the project team as a request from a customer, and we'll see if they'll be willing to consider that.
All right, thank you. One other question. In this table on the ISO website, can you add a separate column showing the date for implementation date cutoff so we can easily see that? And Also, will there be time where we can add projects directly in RIMS instead of PDF? So those both came in from Nick.
Andrew or Priyanka, are either one of you the folks that are in charge of the full network model document on the website, or is that a different team?
This is Andrew. That's actually handled by a different team. That's their document, but we can sure ask them about adding that to the calendar.
Okay.
So I think we can take that internally.
Nick, with that question. Okay, so Nick, with that question, we'll pass that along as a request to the folks that create this full network model build schedule, and see if they're willing to make that change so that that date is just out there and you don't have to do the counting of the 15 days every time. And then I think there was a follow-up question as well.
Yeah, about adding projects directly in RIMS instead of the PDF.
Do you know, Nick, from a enhancement schedule, whether or not that is something that is planned?
I don't know. I was wondering if there was a time where we can just hit okay, new project, rather than having to do it in the Excel PDF form.
Okay, sorry, and I think when I said Nick, I meant to say Andrew, to ask Andrew if he knew the answer to that question. I was just reading your name and thinking of him. So Andrew, do you know if there are any plans in the future to have these created directly in RIMS?
Yeah, I think it's listed as a future enhancement, but there are a lot of enhancements. Obviously, this is a rapidly changing industry, so there are enhancements that are, when it's kind of these next leaps, you can kind of think of these quantum leaps in RIMS. They take a few years to work through to make sure that the existing system works while also making these more advanced changes. So it is a planned enhancement, but it's probably a few years out.
Okay. So thanks for setting expectations on that timeline. Appreciate that. All right, so I'm going to move to the end slide here so that we can look at that for a moment. Quick check to see if there's any final questions before we go into our closing remarks.
I'm not currently seeing any additional questions in the chat and no raised hands at this time for verbal questions.
Okay, thanks so much, everyone. Appreciate your participation and asking questions. I hope that we were able to give you all the information you needed to be successful with this new form and the implementation deadlines that we are going to be putting in place. If you have questions on anything that we've presented here, you can email them to customerreadiness@CAISA.com. And this concludes our webinar for today. Thank you so much for your participation. We hope that you found it useful and informative, and hope that you have a great rest of your day.